It's Wednesday webinar time. That's right. We're back for another edition of the Wednesday webinar here in the California, Nevada Annual Conference. We're glad that you're with us. My name is Craig Brown. I serve as the Executive Director of Congregational Development for our annual conference, and along with our Director of Communications, Selby Ewing, and also our Communications Associate, Tua Yang. We are the back end of the Wednesday webinar. I function as the host, and Selby and Tua are doing a fantastic job of keeping us on track and moving forward. You'll hear from Selby a little bit later on after we have some time for Q&A. Again, I want to welcome you to the Wednesday webinar. If you've never used the Zoom webinar interface, it's a little different than a regular Zoom meeting. Down on the bottom of the screen, you'll notice several buttons, one of which being the chat button. If you hit chat, you'll see the chat window appear to the right, and you'll see the chat waterfall with everyone sharing over there on the side. I just want to make sure you know that in the chat window, you can click a little pop-up menu there near where you type, and you can select whether you want only panelists to see the comments that you share, which would be in this case, DS Deborah and DS Blake, along with myself, Selby and Tua, or if you want everyone to see, you would change that little menu to all panelists and attendees, then everyone would be able to see your comments there. So please feel free to put anything in the chat. However, I will ask that if you do have questions that you want to ask, that you put those in the question and answer interface. And that's another button you'll see on the bottom of your Zoom window, Q&A. If you press that button, you'll be able to type a question in. We're not going to deal with questions until after our two district superintendents lead us through their time. So if you do have a question that comes up along the line that you think of, go ahead and type it in and just let it be there so you don't lose it as we're moving through the presentation, and we'll try to answer it when we get to the end. Every Wednesday webinar, we try to feature a topic that is helpful and engaging to the life of the local church. And we're excited for this week's topic because it's really focusing on how it is we bring a sense of order to the life of the church. And order doesn't mean dictating. It doesn't mean controlling everything. One of the things that we recognize in the United Methodist Church that elders are ordained to four things: word, sacrament, order, and service. And today we're focusing on that order word and what it means for us to order the life of the church in the middle of a pandemic. And so we're very, very grateful that we have two of our district superintendents with us today to help lead us through this time together. We have Superintendent Blake Busick, who is the superintendent of the Great Northern District. And we also have the dean of our cabinet, who is the Central Valley District Superintendent, Deborah Brady. And so we're thankful for their leadership in our midst, and they're going to be leading us. I'll be back with you a little bit later on when we get into our Q&A time, but Blake and Deborah, we're so thankful for your leadership, thankful for your thoughtfulness as you've prepared for today. We have well over 100 people here that are ready to receive that which you have to offer. And so we're just thankful for your ministry and your leadership in our midst. Now I'm going to turn things over to you.
Very good. Well, good to be with all of you, and I'm glad to be on this with my colleague, Deborah Brady. We're excited to share with you some things about ordering the life of the church. I know I've been attending all these webinars every Wednesday, and they've just been really rich and full, so we're praying that this might be a very meaningful time for you as well this Wednesday. We dream of the day when every church will awaken passionate followers of Jesus who are swept up in God's movement to heal and liberate the world. And so we want to ask one another today, you know, how does your church stir up disciples, and how does your church be about the business of being transformed from an institution to a discipling movement? And how has our recent experience of sheltering in place create the conditions conducive for such a transformation? Now, I'd like to begin with you by kind of talking in a very general way, setting the context in a macro way, a very general way. And then in a few moments, I'll give it over to Deborah, and we'll get much more specific about some nuts and bolts. But both those things need to kind of come together, the general and the specific. If we're general, we don't get specific, we never take action. But if we're specific and never get general, then sometimes we lose our way, or we lack the inspiration or motivation for our action. So they both have to come together, and we want to deal with both of those things today with you on this topic. But we're going to start with kind of the more general idea. So by the end of this hour, it's our hope that the deep Wesleyan DNA that may be latent within you is fully activated. You know, Wesley's genius was not his creative preaching or his innovative theology or his cutting edge worship, right? Wesley's genius was his ability to create a method for a discipling movement. And that method impacted the world dramatically. A method for Methodists, right? We call this ordering the life of the church. As Craig just mentioned, pastors are ordained to word, sacrament, service, and order. And together with lay partnerships in the ordering of the life of the church, we attend to these essential functions of being the church. Now, we want to start out by saying that, you know, order is much more than administration. It's discovering the method in your context, in your specific context, to awaken disciples and keep them awake and keep them growing in what they've discovered to be a movement of God to heal and liberate the world. So the method, the order, was Wesley's genius, and we already have that in our DNA. It's much more than being a good administrator. Again, it's about creating environments and processes for the Holy Spirit to bring people into an encounter with Christ that awakens them and that nurtures them, and that helps them to grow in the grace and love of God. A long time ago, George Whitefield shared this comment with Wesley and with those who were there. He said, "My brother." He said this quote you may be familiar with. He said, "My brother Wesley acted wisely. The souls that were awakened under his ministry, he joined in class and thus preserved the fruits of his labor. This I neglected, and my people are a rope of sand." He preserved the fruits. He had a way to order and to gather those awakenings that helped it to develop. Now, you can be or you can have a pastor who is an amazing preacher. You can have a pastor or be a pastor that really your preaching just cuts people to the heart. And it awakens people into all different aspects of experiencing the grace of God. You can be a congregation that has passionate worship and involves all the heart, soul, mind, and strength of a human being. And it can be a powerful moment, right? A powerful moment that you experience in worship or hearing preaching together. But if you don't have a method for how to apply and build on that moment, then it's just a moment. Just a moment. Maybe a great moment, maybe a memorable moment, but how do you preserve the fruits of that moment? That's what we're talking about in terms of ordering the life of the church. If we don't do that, it may just be like any great other experience, watching a movie or reading a play or being with friends. It may be a wonderful moment, but it really is a rope of sand. It doesn't have any great impact beyond that moment, except for in our memory. We need to capture it or frame it or provide an environment for it to be able to be applied and work itself out. Now, you may be a good United Methodist who is able to teach and describe, you know, all about prevenient and justifying and sanctifying grace. But what are the intentional spaces and opportunities you are creating that provide the context for that grace actually to be experienced and known? And how do these fit together? How are they coordinated? How do they happen to be experienced in that way? Paul described the experience that he shared in this way in Colossians. Paul said, "It is Christ whom we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone in all wisdom, so that we may present everyone, here it is, mature in Christ. For this I toil and struggle with all the energy that he powerfully inspires me with. Paul was toiling, Paul was working hard, and so do we. Why? So that we might present everyone mature in Christ. That's our goal. How do we mature people? How do we mature? So again, let's go back. Let's imagine again that we are awakening, passionate followers of Jesus. We're making disciples. How do we wake up? How do we stay awake? And how do we engage all of our senses and all of our being? And imagine again, we're being swept up in God's movement to heal and liberate. And finally, imagine again about what a discipleship system, a discipling movement would look like in your context. Can you picture that? We got to keep that in mind as we get specific here in a minute. How do you picture that? How do you see that? What's God putting in your mind, in your imagination, in your understanding there? Now, I want to say this. If you don't have a discipling process, you are not ordering the life of your church, because you order around discipleship. Now, you may have a very efficient organization, a very efficient institution. You may have church council meetings that start on time and end on time, that are planned every month, that have agendas. You may have committees that feed into that. You may be just a well-oiled machine. But if you don't have a discipleship process, you don't really have attending to the ordering of the life of the church, because the order and in the administration in that order is about that process, maturing in Christ, right? Being passionate followers of Jesus, being a part of God's movement to heal and liberate. If you don't have a discipling process by choice, by default, you'll be ordering the life of your church around perpetuating an institution. And the purpose of the institution, right, is simply to be perpetuated. You will have slipped into Wesley's worst nightmare, right? You remember this when Wesley said this? He said, I can't get there. There we go. I do not fear that the people called Methodists will ever cease to exist, either in Europe or America. I only fear that they shall exist as a dead sect, having the form of religion, but not the power thereof. And that undoubtedly will be the case unless they hold fast to the doctrine, disciplines, and spirit which they first set out. Adhere to the doctrine, disciplines, and spirit from which they first set out. Disciplines. That's what we're talking about in the ordering the life of the church, is how do we order it so that we practice together the things that help us to grow in grace, the things that help us to mature in Christ. Now, when you do have a discipling process, then you order the entire church around that. You align everything around and with it. Everything. Even your administrative committees are aligned and support that process. So our finance committee, for instance, is considering how do they help the church make wise decisions in the use of financial matters to support that discipling, maturing process that helps people be called and grown and equipped and sent as God's messengers and disciples in the world. How do the trustees help to create through buildings and grounds and facilities, sacred spaces for people to come and to be awakened and to find the love of God and to grow in it and to be sent from there to impact the world? Everything is questioned and is thoughtful about how it relates to that central ordering of the life of the church. And before I give it over to Deborah, think about this, that now is quite an opportune time. For the old way in which you have ordered the life of your church previous to our sheltering in place order has been lying fallow for some time now, right? You've had to find different ways of ordering the life of your church in this sheltering in place moment, and so it's been disrupted. Now, I don't know about you, but if you've ever, in the past, when I've tried to make some changes in the life of the ordering, life of the church, it's very difficult. Even if you and everybody in the church says, yes, we want to order it this way, it's very hard to do. Why? Because there's momentum, there's inertia, there's a flow that's already happening. And even if everybody wants to do it, it's still very hard to make those changes. And usually not everybody wants to. Usually there's also resistance to it as well, right? We know that. But even in the best of circumstances, that inertia, that flow, that river needs to be disrupted, usually, in order to be able to kind of, in some ways, regather, reorder in a different way. Well, it has been. We've been sheltering in place. It's been disrupted. And so it may be possible now, more than maybe any other time in your church's recent history, to reshape the ordering the life of your church in ways maybe you've been dreaming about or working towards or have an insight about how we do that around our discipleship process, maybe now than ever. As you're starting to do it now in different ways, sheltering in place, but as we begin to emerge from that, there may be things that you see. Where we had to reflect more deeply now about what it means to be the church. We've always said the church is not a building, and we've had to live into that now in maybe even more important ways. And you've been finding new ways to connect and worship and grow in faith and serve the world. And what about those things that we've learned that as we begin to emerge from this also, we want to continue and build upon and reshape the way we order that? Now, finally, in this section, we do this as lay and clergy partners, right? So as we talk now about specific things, nuts and bolts, we want to keep our eye on the big picture, what it is we're doing. We're trying to mature in Christ. We're trying to be and create passionate followers of Jesus. We're trying to be sensitive to God's movement to heal and liberate in the world, and to do that together. So now we'd like to take that general framework now and look more specifically about some nuts and bolts around administration, around organizational processes, around some of the different things we've adopted around these protocols recently, around even about how we do data collecting and reporting. For many ways, we might look at those kind of things around, are we bearing fruit? Are we maturing disciples? Even the way we report data can help us to evaluate that and make some new directions. So I'm going to give over to Deborah now, and grateful for our time together and for this time to share with you.
Thank you, Blake. And hello, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. So one of the things I want to remind you is that the word ministry is the root word of administration. And so often, I've heard, as I've gone to conduct church conferences or visited with people speak with disdain about administration and sometimes don't attend enough to it, for it is a resource to do all the things that Blake was just talking about. And on the other hand, I also see people on the other end of the spectrum who believe that our administrative processes are the purpose of the church. And so what we want to do is sort of come somewhere in the middle to say the purpose of our administration is to be a resource for our disciple making. And the first thing I want to remind you is the book of discipline is your friend. So it provides such helpful information. And I want to just remind you of some of the administrative things we're talking about. We were asked to talk about how do we carry out this basic administration during the time of the COVID-19 protocols, but many of us need help with the administration even when we're not observing these protocols. And as Blake was saying, this is a pivotal moment in which we might be able to use this time to rethink administration for the future. Streamline it, make it more effective, make it more focused, make it more connected to the mission strategy of our church. So one of the things that every church should have is, besides the book of discipline, is guideline books. And I've been surprised at the number of churches that haven't heard of them, even pastors. But Cokesbury sells these booklets for like $4 a piece, and you can get them in a streamlined fashion, downloaded electronically. And so there is a guidelines book for every committee imaginable, and you can just pick the ones that come for your church, or you can order a whole set for $150 for everything. They get published every 4 years, so every 4 years after General Conference, you should get a new set. So reminding that the basic unit of our administration is the Church Council. The Church Council's purpose is to articulate the vision, to set the strategy, implement it, and evaluate it, right? And for the purpose of effective ministry. And the Book of Discipline gives us freedom about how we do that for our own context. But there are certain things that must be done. All right, so there are 4 essential committees. One is the Committee on Nominations and Lay Leadership Development, chaired by the pastor. The Staff Parish or Pastor Parish Relations Committee. That must have 5 members plus the lay leader and lay member to the annual conference. The Board of Trustees, who are the official board of directors for your church. And it's important that every time a new group is elected, you register those names on the website for the Secretary of State. You register the officers. They have signing authority for legal agreements for your church. And then finally, the Committee on Finance. And then you need to have some component that is addressing the nurture, outreach, and witness. Now, I've seen many of our churches go to a one board model instead of having a full set of 9 people serving on all of those various committees. They have a board of 12 people who carry out those functions. So let me give you an example. And if any of you would like me to email you my notes, just put your email address in the chat room and I'll make sure you get this so you have this outlined for you, but you can take this notes. So these groups have to meet 4 times a year. You want to make sure that an agenda is developed and that someone's taking minutes, recording them, distributing them, and that they're approved each meeting. But assume that you had 12 people plus your pastor. Here's how it could work. 3 people on the board are the elected trustees, and one of them is named as chair. 5 people are identified as SPRC, or the Pastor Parish Relations Committee, and one of them is chairperson. You have one person who does the role of lay member and lay leader, and many churches then has that person chair whatever kind of body of nurture, outreach, and witness that, you know, provides oversight and planning for your worship and evangelism and discipleship groups and outreach, membership care, things like that. And then you have a treasurer, you have a financial secretary who double as your membership secretary. They're caring for many of the same records. And then the one person who's the chairperson who can also be the finance chairperson. And so what happens is some of the churches I've seen functioning very well will meet quarterly. Sometimes they'll add a meeting in there if they need to. But they start off with the Board of Trustees meeting, and at the same time, the SPRC is meeting, right? So that maybe is for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. And then they come together for a finance committee meeting in which they hear and receive and approve their financial reports. And then they conduct their church council meeting and deal with general strategy and vision. And so with 12 people, even in a small church, you convene all of the essential functions of administration. So of course, right now we can't convene together. And so some people haven't convened at all, but it's about time. We've been sheltering in place for 2.5 months. So we are going to be needing to plan some meetings. So many, I think Craig told us about half of our churches are having some kind of digital presence in worship. And so I know there's digital capacity to order a free conference call line from some telephone service, and where you could convene a conference call and email out your agenda and your minutes and conduct your meeting that way. Certainly there are meeting platforms like Zoom, GoToMeeting, WebEx, so you could do a little bit of research about that so that anyone with a smartphone, tablet, or computer could connect that way, at least with audio, and they all provide an option for someone with a telephone to connect if they don't have a camera or they don't have a computer, right? And so sometimes meetings can be conducted by email. And this is most effective if there's one decision to be made, right? We need to approve the budget, or we need to decide whether to do this or that. Email meetings are not generally helpful when you're dealing with an array of issues or dealing with strategic issues, right? So I have noticed that many of our churches have been effectively conducting various kinds of meetings through Zoom. That's the platform most common right now. And all of us as district superintendents are, in fact, introducing new pastors to the Staff Parish Relations Committee through Zoom. And I'll have to tell you, when this idea was first approached, when it was still sort of optional, I was very negative about it. A couple of my colleagues in the Bay Area, where they had stricter protocols, said they were going to start using Zoom. And I said, oh no, in Central Valley, we need to be face-to-face. I'm going to actually go to the location. But within a week, that wasn't possible. And I have to commend our lay members of churches. The SPRCs have been just brilliant in adapting to the technology. We spend the first few minutes working out the bugs and making sure everybody has a good connection, but we've actually had some very meaningful conversations and an ability really for these members to get to know the pastor that the bishop intends to appoint on July 1st. So I'm here to say that I have been one who's been converted. So some of the advantages of meeting this way, of course, you could type some advantages. You could let others in the chat room know if you've been using some of these platforms and how you have found them to work. I know Craig Brown shared with the cabinet an article from Harvard Business Review, which gave some tips and techniques for leading Zoom meetings about how to keep them moving along, how to engage people, etc. So you could look that up, and that might be helpful for you in these new protocols of convening meetings. But it's fairly simple if someone has a telephone to really, even if they just have a regular old non-smartphone, to engage people in meaningful conversations. So please put in the chat room what your experience has been, what ideas you've had for convening meetings. But some of the advantages are that I've seen in churches is it's allowing more diversity in the conversation. Some members of the church don't like to go out at night for safety reasons because they don't drive at night. And then that, if we only have meetings during the day, it excludes people who work during the day. Sometimes people have meetings after church, but sometimes it's not possible. So having these Zoom meetings allows people of all ages to participate in leadership. It eliminates needs for childcare. It's better for traffic and the environment. So I expect to see that a lot of churches are going to opt for at least a couple of their meetings a year to be done electronically, just because it is so convenient and efficient and engages people. Of course, it's difficult to have a meaningful conversation if you have more than about a dozen people on there. So it depends on the kind of meeting you're having, whether you're just informing like we are today, or you're really trying to have a discussion. I have found that Zoom is a little bit more difficult to get used to having those generative kind of conversations where we're brainstorming or we're deliberating a difficult topic, because it's easy to get interrupted and talk over people and when to mute and unmute and all of those kind of things. But overall, I think there's some tremendous advantages. One of the good ideas that I heard coming out of our Visalia church is they're considering a new strategy about when there's a change in living location for one of their members into some kind of community living situation. It might be temporary for several weeks or months, recovering from some kind of surgery or accident. Or it might be when people decide to sell their home and move into a retirement community. In those cases, if the person doesn't have a computer, they're going to find a way to purchase some kind of tablet and get it completely loaded up with the right software and connections so that that person at any time they wish can connect to their live stream worship. It's going to be a permanent way of doing things. And the pastor there, Steve Creel, reported to me that he found that many of the members who were most resistant to online worship and technology are now the #1 champions, because they're finding that it is so meaningful to them in this time of isolation. So I'm really expecting that a lot of these ways of ordering the church are an opportunity for us to offer new ministries and connect with people. So let's see, a couple things. Blake mentioned our annual reports. And I know for many of you that work with your pastors to get these various reports in, it can seem tedious, but we have looked at studies over the years, and we know that in general, churches who input their worship attendance and other metrics into our database, what is it we call vital signs? When they're tracking all of their discipleship metrics, they tend to be the fastest growing churches. They tend to be the most vital. And we think it's just because they have these systems of paying attention. But you know, every year our reports seem to surprise people. And so in administering the life of the church, we ask that you sort of think through the data that you need to collect. Adrian Pell is our conference statistician, and he is super helpful in getting the statistical tables done. There are 3 tables that we submit, and they're due by February 15th every year. Table 1 is all of your discipleship metrics. Table 2 is all of your expenses, and table 3 is your income. These are basic things that we need to track. And I said, you know, we've been collecting this data since 1786, the Christmas conference. And he said, oh no, Deborah, it was before then. We'd been collecting it for 10 or 20 years before then. And it was really part of what Blake was saying about John Wesley's gift at ordering the life of the church, knowing that part of the order was to keep track of our information, because it allows us to look at trends, it allows us to see problems, it allows us to see fruitfulness. It's not the end all, but it's just part of the data that we consider. So you can always just print out those tables, you have access to them, and just remember, we need to be tracking this information all year long, and if you're keeping track of it all year long, it won't take you very long to get those done on time. In addition, you have your church conference reports, and our communications associate, Tua, gets those online usually by the end of August. And these reports also are very important to us. The district superintendents use them all the time to just check in on the life of the church. And they are not that time consuming to fill out. And we ask everything to be done online now. They're all input through your church dashboard. So again, it means learning technology and paying attention to your computer. Those reports are due about a week before your church conference. So the deadline varies, but it's going to be sometime probably October, November, December. And then finally, you have end of the year reports that are due to the cabinet. The pastor has reports and the SPRC has reports. And the Staff Parish Relations Committee is given the responsibility to make a recommendation about their pastor's appointment. It's a consultation. They also submit an assessment of the pastor's ministry, and they update the church profile, giving us information about what's the church's mission strategy, how are their small groups going, things like that. And then the pastor makes similar reports. They report on their ministry. They also give a consultation about how they would like their appointment to be considered for the next year. So those reports are all due on December 1st. So we have February 15th, the fall, and December 1st, those 3 cycle of reports. And if you lay them out in that way and get your leadership team to take responsibility for them, it's one way to share leadership. One thing I wanted to note about administration is last week on the webinar, I thought Pastor Mike Carroll made a good point about how do you make decisions. And sometimes during a time of crisis, like when we first went into the shelter in place and we quickly had to decide what are we going to do about worship next Sunday, sometimes you need to just convene a small group of people, just some key leaders, and make a decision. But as we get into the routine of things, we need to broaden that out so that we have diversity of thought and creative ideas. But again, there's also such a problem as having too many people involved. So you have to sort of decide what's the right sort of leadership team for your church, and how do you manage those conversations and those decision-making processes, whether it's by email for a one-time thing, conference calls, or some kind of meeting platform like Zoom. A couple of things that I wanted to think about, and I would love for you to share some ideas, is about how does evangelism and invitation work in the time of COVID-19? What I've noticed is most of our churches who are having some kind of digital online presence for their worship service are increasing their skills at evangelism. They're finding ways that maybe don't feel so scary. I find lots of people on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook who are posting their pastor sermons, devotions, inviting people to Bible studies, inviting people to worship. And so you might think about how that could be a permanent way of doing evangelism. I've known of a couple of groups who are who are using Meetup, and they're creating some interest groups on Zoom through Meetup and linking those two kinds of technologies as well. So when COVID-19 is over and we can go back to some kind of interaction in person, we might really think about what we've learned in terms of evangelism and how we can apply it into our in-person context as well. So I know we're going to pause for some questions, I think, in just a few minutes. But one of the things I wanted you to think about in terms of our hospitality and welcoming processes and how we connect that to discipleship is how you might think about designing some membership classes. Remember, our goal isn't to just increase membership. Our goal is to make disciples. And having a meaningful and sufficient membership process is a way that you begin to set the tone, communicate the culture for discipleship. When I was a new pastor in the early to mid 1990s, we had some church development consultants working with us. And so people from my era will remember that they had a model called the Discovery Class, which they recommended having 7 or 8 sessions because that's the number of sessions it takes for people to bond together in a group. And so for all of the 20 years I served the local church, I used that model, and it was a 2-hour class. I think we ended up modeling it on 7 sessions, with the last session the day that people joined the church, and then we would have a potluck for the class. If it was a smaller church, you could have it for the whole church. But we really had 45 minutes of teaching, a break, and then 45 minutes in small group of 4 to 6 people, facilitated by a mature and trained church member, so that we began the model of faith sharing and bonding. And then as people were ready to join the church, they had a week of preparation in which they had to fill out a discipleship plan that said, what are the next steps they're going to take? Which small group are they going to join? Where do they feel called to be in ministry and live out their faith, whether that's in an administrative committee or not, through some mission group or in their community some way. And then we would have a faith promise card for them to make a financial commitment. And they sealed all of that in an envelope. And during the liturgy of joining the church, they placed this on the altar as the sign of the covenant that they were making as they became a member of this particular local church. So I'd be happy to send you my template for that if you're interested. But I found that it really created the context that the way we do things is through small groups. And one thing I learned as a pastor, just in terms of as you think about your welcoming processes and as you think about the people and how to follow up with those who might be leaving emails or text messages for you during this online engagement, is that if an adult shows up to your worship service in person or online, and they have not been engaged in church for a long time, for years, there's usually some crisis going on in their life that's changed, in which they are seeking to reconnect with God in some way. It could be illness diagnosis, a death, a divorce, a child in trouble, a loss of a job. And so often in our churches, someone like that comes in the door and we're so happy to see a new person. That vampire evangelism takes over, and we just want to grab that person and put them on the finance committee, or, oh, you're a builder, we're going to put you on the trustees. And we fail to really address the brokenheartedness of their life and the discipleship aspects of first reconnecting them in the life of faith. And so I would really encourage you to be thinking about that. I think it's possible. And I think next week we're going to be learning, our webinar is going to be focused on small groups. And so I think you could be saying, how could we do a membership class online and really begin to engage the new people that we've been meeting, who've been watching our worship, who've been texting us, who've been joining our Bible studies online. So those are the quick pointers for now. And Blake, I wanted to say, any comments you want to make or ways you want to join in, and then I think Craig's going to help facilitate some Q&A.
I think we're ready for the Q&A. Really appreciate that, Deborah. Maybe I just make one comment that I was thinking about when you were talking about the evangelism and invitation and hospitality processes. Sometimes what helps me when I'm trying to think of ordering and creating these processes that Deborah was just describing, sometimes it helps me to think of one person. How this one person would find the church, get connected to the church, be nurtured in the church, be welcomed in the church, grow in the church. You know what I'm saying? Just take one person through a process. How would that work for that person? Then take somebody different and think about how that would happen for them, and how that would happen for them in this context when we're in this situation and later on. So when I'm thinking about how do you think about the whole process of the discipling process, sometimes it helps me just to kind of mentally think about how a person who's connecting in different ways and how they go through that whole thing and whether that happens. And I love the way Deborah's describing some things to consider around some of those things we need processes around that connects people with evangelism, invitation, hospitality, welcoming, membership, growth. So yeah, thank you, Deborah.
So,
all
Craig?
right, I am here. You will hear me, but you will not see me,
Okay.
which is often the preferred option for many people. So we want to get to some questions, and a lot of the questions coming in about people wanting to have those materials, Deborah, that you talked about.
Okay.
And so I think what we're going to try to do is, instead of trying to email everyone, one of the things we do every week is we post the recording of the webinar on the conference website. And when we post it, we also provide any links to files that are used. So we'll try to get those files and maybe put them on our website so people can just download them from there, if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Good. It'll be a resource everyone will be able to use. When I teach the CLM class on the same topic, I give them the new member class I used to use when I was a pastor of a church as well, as an example of what to do. That's just a great resource. I'm glad you're able to share it. So a few questions, and because we're kind of talking about the ordering of the life of the church, they're kind of all over the place, all right? So I've got a few of them here. So let me ask the first one. Have there been any recommendations on how to report attendance while our doors are shuttered?
Adrian Pell sent an email to me that he got from someone at GCFNA. And for now, they are encouraging us to keep track of the households that we can count who are tuning into our digital platform. Of course, we can't tell how many people per household, but we can at least count that as a worship. And GCFNA is going to be sending out guidelines to us. I think one of the questions I asked back is, I know in the Central Valley we have a number of churches in which the pastor is preparing an order of worship and a sermon, and they're sending it through the US mail or by email out to all the members of their church. And then they all agree at 10 o'clock or whatever their normal worship time, they all pull this out and do it at home. So they're not digitally connected, but they're all worshiping at home. And so I've encouraged pastors who are doing that to sort of find a way to keep track and have people report to them about whether they're using that resource so they can keep track of people engaged that way. That's a little bit harder to track. Blake, I don't know what you've been
Yeah, I
doing.
wanted to add just something so I think there are ways in which it's helpful to have agreed upon ways to collect the information so we can kind of compare and use them. But as a local church pastor or lay leader, I think you also want to ask yourself, why are we collecting this information? What's it going to be used for? It's fine that it needs to be used for those who are asking for it on the reports.
Mhm.
But also the more important question is why do we want to look at it? What do we want and what do we want to know? And the
Mhm.
important thing is that if you're looking for trends, it's just important to make sure you're doing it consistently. So how you've decided to collect it, you keep collecting it in the same way so you can see trends that'll help you to know the impact of what you're doing. So I'm always it's important to me always is that when we're collecting reports, yes, there's a way we standardize that to do that together so it means similar things. But the more important question is, what am I as a clergy or lay leader doing with that report, doing
Yes.
with those numbers? What is it telling me?
Right.
And what kind of numbers would help me more if I
Yes.
collected them? So that was the only other thing I would add.
Right. Thank you.
All right, good. I'll add to that a quick Google search will show you some different practices of different denominations. I know GCFA has some advice coming out soon. In most
Right.
cases, most of the best practices now are pointing to a multiplier, that you take the number that had the online view and you apply a multiplier to it. And so the wrangling is about the multiplier, what
Right.
the multiplier should be. So some good stuff out there, and hopefully good stuff coming from the denomination as well. So another question here. Let's see. Question is this. I'm going to read the whole thing to you. All right. How do you help those who are active but hesitant to become members overcome their member phobia? And how do you get people to see the value of small groups when you have people who are highly resistant to it?
Mhm. Blake, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, the approach I often take, of course, it depends on the person themselves, but I often, again, when I'm talking with someone or a group of people, I'm not talking about membership as much as I want to talk to them about um, grace, about being connected to Christ, about being part of the body, and why it's important and why it's helpful to the body to make a public affirmation of my commitment to Christ and to this body. It's just helpful. It's encouraging. It builds the body up. So, the membership means a lot of different things to different people. In our context, membership means discipleship. It means being a part of the body of Christ. It means watching out over one another in love. It means sharing in mission together. So the hesitancy, I think, sometimes is people having to do with how they interpret membership. And I want to flip that around to saying, what's the life we're trying to live into? And how are we doing this together? And how is it that we help each other when we make public affirmations to one another that I'm with you, we're in this together, we're on this journey together. That's why we commit and make connections with one another. So to me, that's the kind of thing I try to get us focused on. The reason for doing that, it's not just to have some benefits of membership. It has to do with sharing life together, growing together, and making commitments together are one of the ways we actually do grow.
Right. Yeah, I would just say I wouldn't try to talk people into being members. In the discovery classes that we did on the last session in person, we went over our membership expectations, that you will be in a small group, that you will find a way to serve and grow in this way, that you'll be a regular and faithful giver moving towards a tithe toward the church. So we had a number of commitments of what we expected. And we just said, this might not be a commitment you're ready to make, but we still welcome your participation in worship in whatever way. There was one man I remember particularly who was a little resistant to joining. And the thing why he decided to join is one Sunday we were commissioning a group of UMVIM volunteers to go on a medical mission trip to Guatemala. And there were a couple hundred people in worship, and we had the whole team of 15 people lying in the center aisle, and we all came together, lay hands on them like we do at annual conference for confirming appointments and blessing the newly appointed pastor. And that was the thing that made him decide he wanted to join the church. I mean, who knew? It was just the right moment for him of deciding that that's what called to him. So I'm with Blake, focus on discipleship, not on the membership part. after some years of doing the discovery class, I found that longtime church members wanted to start coming to the discovery class. And so we started letting members come because they were real. There was enough people that had gone through that it was creating a culture and a buzz that they didn't feel a part of. And they wanted to come and find out what was being talked about in the class. So that was a good introduction to small groups for some who had been resistant to it. Start with the people who are willing and let the others come along.
Wanted to maybe add one more thing. Deborah triggered it for me when she talked about describing the commitments that people are invited to make. And I think that's really key is be clear about here's the commitments we're inviting you into. Now, as a pastor or lay leader or Christian, what I know is that people grow by their commitments. So when we're offering them these commitments, it's not kind of a burden. It's inviting them into a deeper way of life, to practice some things that are going to bless them. So when we're making clear the commitments, I think, they may or may not be ready for it, but we know we're inviting them into more life, because these are commitments that are basic to how human beings, we think, function vitally. And so we can be clear about those and give people space to make them or not to make them, but we can feel good about we're inviting them into maturing as a human being, because that's the way we grow, is through the making the right commitments and then having a family, having a body around us that we live those out together. And when we don't live out together, we kind of regroup and reconnect and share it together though.
All right, we have another question lined up, but if others have questions, hit that Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window and type your questions in. We have a few more minutes to do some questions. I'd love to hear from more of you, so please feel free to drop them in there and we'll get them. This question has to do with the districts. All right, so it's good that we have two district superintendents here. One of the first questions we got right after we started, what is the status on the district unions?
Well, Craig, you could also help us with this. You've been a great partner in this. So the district unions have all been established with elected boards who have been now convening. And the extension societies related geographically to those district unions have been invited to merge with them. And that is in various states of progress across the conference. So in the Central Valley, we'll probably be finishing up our documents next month. And then once all those agreements have taken place, the district conference, when we convene, we haven't yet set a date, it'll be sometime before annual conference. The district conference then has to vote on the final merger documents. So, Blake, what else? Great Northern sort of in the same.
Yeah.
I think all of our districts are in process.
We're in the same part of the process, exactly.
So I'm so excited about some of the good work the district unions have already started doing around mission strategy and revitalization. And I know we have a presentation coming to the Central Valley District Union Board at the end of May to participate in funding a new church start in the Central Valley. So doing some good work.
All right, good. I wanted to mention earlier in the chat waterfall over on the right, I pasted in the paragraph from the Book of Discipline that D.S. Deborah made reference to earlier about having your church perhaps organized as a single, it's commonly called single board governance,
Yes.
rather than the traditional structure. And I'm gonna, in case it got lost in the waterfall, I'm gonna paste it in one more time, paragraph 247.2. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because a little bit more in detail about that single board governance idea, because this is something that's relatively new in the Book of Discipline that was added not that long ago, that allowed church to organize this way with the permission of its district superintendent. Can you maybe share a little bit about what in your opinion as superintendents you think the situation needs to be for a congregation to really need to think about this? Is it the size of the congregation? Is it the complexity of its ministry? What do you think would cause a congregation to maybe wonder, should we think about switching to single board governance?
Like, I have some things, but go ahead and say, do you have some things that you've noticed in the Great Northern?
Well, one of the things is size, and we have some very small churches, and so in the Great Northern District, so some of them, because of size, went to operate in this way. Um, Most anything that we're considering, though, I think we would always say, you know, what's your mission strategy?
Mhm.
What is it that you're focused on? What's your vision? How do you see God calling you to be the church in that area? And then after getting clarity on that, be able to ask kind of the organizational or ordering questions about how best to accomplish that. One of the things that I caution some of our churches who go into a single board governance, and Deborah outlined it really well about how to make sure you're kind of keeping track of all the different aspects and making sure you're functioning in all the different ways, is you don't want the single board governance to collapse into administration only.
Right.
And some of them kind of, they collapse into always doing finance, trustees, and staff parish kinds of work, and they don't really talk about their mission strategy, their discipleship strategy. And that's the more important piece. All that other stuff is to support that discipleship work, that mission work, that service work. And so I always caution those who are doing that to make sure that you're paying most of your attention to how you're ordering the life of your church, how you're organized to fulfill the mission God's given you in that place, and not to get collapsed into dealing with, you know, every decision about the color of the carpet and the paint of the thing is consumed with, you know, with the meeting. So you need to have some real discipline in order to do that. You need a very good chairperson to make sure the body is giving adequate care and the right amount of time to certain areas. Some things are more important than others. And so one of the things you really need is a really good chairperson who can really guide the group to the many functions that it will have. And I love the way Deborah described too. You can break that off a little bit, you know, in a single evening where you're meeting in one form and another and then another, and you kind of make sure you're attending to that. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
Right. Yes, and thank you, Craig, for mentioning it, because if your church wants to do this, they need to present this proposal at your charge conference in the fall to have the charge vote on doing this way of administration. And in addition to having a small size, I've had some churches, even larger churches, one of them was Centenary in Modesto, that asked to try the one church board because they wanted to do exactly what Blake was talking about. They wanted more people available to work on their community outreach strategy. They started this really big ministry with the neighborhood grammar school and found this whole new group of immigrants from the Middle East that they started English as a second language and all kinds of ministries with. They wanted to focus on small group ministry, younger adult ministry, family ministry, and they just found there was too many people whose time was tied up in going to so many administrative committee meetings. So they wanted to simplify and focus that aspect so that they could focus more on the nurture, outreach, and worship. So after they tried it for a while, they realized that they needed to spin off the board of trustees and have a full board because they had a large campus that needed a lot of needs and they had too many things to talk about. And it was too distracting for the church council to try to function that way. So they're still in process. So sometimes it takes some experimenting to say, what is the most effective way to carry out our mission strategy?
Thank you both. I'm glad you're able to talk about that a little bit more. I think that's one of the hidden gems in the Book of Discipline that lots of congregations can be potentially discerning and praying about for their future. Questions come in that I want to address, and this will probably be our last question, and I think it's an important one. What would you share as ideas for keeping the connection with children happening during this time when the church is not able to gather physically together?
Well, I know several churches in the conference. I know I think at Central in Stockton and St. Paul's and some other churches in other districts have been doing godly play online and inviting the kids in for this kind of a Sunday school program. And, you know, our children have gotten really used to learning platforms. And so they're very comfortable doing Zoom and other kinds of things because of their schoolwork. So a number of churches have been doing this. And they've been sharing that resource. So I know that there's several smaller churches that are having their children connect with another church's godly play group, right? Because they don't have enough resources to do their own. I don't know what ideas have you seen, Blake?
Churches that on their website will put some things for children to do while the worship service is going on, for instance. So there may be resources that while the sermon is being watched or something like that, there are resources you could download or use for your kids that relate to the message that day that can be used. So one way to keep them connected. Yeah.
Many of the churches are doing a traditional children's time, and so they'll tell the parents, tell the kids to come over to the computer. We're going to talk to them. I know at Lodi First, they've been filming segments in smaller increments. And so they have one whole video that's only for children, so that can just be accessed by children at their convenience. And they have an ongoing community of puppets who've been interacting with their lessons. So.
Excellent. Excellent. Fantastic responses. I'll add that one of the things you may want to be doing, everyone, to look for these best practices is feel free to do some searches on the internet, either Google to look for some of our churches, because you're going to find on their website some of the practices they have. And then an even better place to find them is surf around a little bit on Facebook. The advantage we often have is that we know the names of churches, and so we're able to just kind of look around and see what other churches are doing. You're going to find lots of best practices about how different ministries happen by just searching around a little bit. You'd be surprised with what you find. Some good stuff out there. All right, I want to thank our two district superintendents, DS Blake, DS Deborah. We're really glad that you could be with us today and talking about something that's very, very important in the life of the church, and that's ordering the life of the church. I'm so glad we had some time to talk about this today. I'm going to turn things over to our Director of Communications, Selby Ewing. She's got a few announcements she's going to share, and I'll be back with you to close things out in just a minute.
Hi, everybody, and wow, Deborah and Blake, thank you so much. What a great session. I always learn a lot when I am listening in, and even though we're colleagues around many tables, I learned a lot today. So thank you so much for that. And just a quick thanks to everybody for coming. Very excited about the wonderful attendance we continue to have. The Wednesday webinars are part of our lineup, weekly lineup that we've been building at the conference, and we have added a new component, which Blake is the current offerer this week. We have started doing spiritual reflections. Every Tuesday they'll be posted, and they are reflections that individuals have around the scriptures in the Revised Common Lectionary for the coming Sunday. So we've been very happy that we've had Skylar, we've had Blake, and we've had Stacy current as well. So all DSs so far, but we're going to broaden that. So really taking care of our spiritual, nurturing our spiritual lives through those. The webinar, of course, is a combination of soft and hard skills that professionals are sharing and will continue to share. And then, of course, the e-newsletter, which is where most of our special news and events are shared, and those are all pushed out through our social media on Facebook and Twitter. I'd encourage you, if you are not currently receiving the Instant Connection, please do sign up. You can find that on the home page of our conference website, cnumc.org. Just so you don't miss a story or miss an event, we put a lot of things in the Instant Connection. And that's really sometimes the only place it'll show up. We tend to post items on our news page on the website. We push them out in social media. But there may be something that just appears in the Instant Connection, and you don't want to miss that. So we don't want you to miss it. Please sign up. And I would just also encourage everyone to send in your stories of what's happening in your local church. I am so excited about the life of the local church. It really is the most important thing for me. And I know for most of us on the conference staff, we want to know what's going on, and we want to share that throughout the conference connection. So I really hope you'll take advantage of the opportunity to send in stories. It's real easy. You can just email them to me, or there is a form online that you can submit them through the Instant Connection. Or you can pick up the phone and give me a call, and I'll be happy to write it up if you just give me some content. But we're always most interested in how the life of your church is working itself out, not only in the days of the pandemic, but as we move on to our new normal, and carry a lot of those practices forward with us. So again, just wrapping up my announcements, and a very big thank you for all of us. I'll say on behalf of Tua, my associate, thank you very much. Tua is really very much the technical glue that holds all of us together, and inspires us with new ways to use technology. So I'll thank him publicly, and next time you see him or email him, just give him a big thank you. And so, Craig, I'll give it back to you.
All right, thanks, Selby. Just a quick word that you can find the Wednesday webinars on the conference website. If you go to the main landing page, cnumc.org, over on the right, you'll see a button right below the bishop's message. That is the Wednesday webinar. If you click on that, you'll see a listing of all the webinars. You will be able to click on this week's webinar, watch a recording of it, replay it for leaders perhaps in your own congregation, and then some of the resources we talked about today that we want to have available to you. We'll list those there so you can download those resources and have them for use in your own local church. Next week's webinar is going to be focused around faith formation and how we do that in the time of a pandemic. And we're really excited next week that we're going to have two facilitators in our midst that have really understood how to do this using virtual interfaces like this. We're going to have the co-pastors of the table with us next week. Linda Du-Hirsu and Matt Smith will be facilitating our time together. And we're going to be doing something very different next week. We're going to be working in breakout rooms next week in small groups and learning how to do some of this work hands-on. And then there's going to be a special opportunity extended to the webinar next week, how to participate in a 6-week training on learning how to do this on a virtual setting as well. So we're excited to be able to share that with you next week. We hope you'll be a part of that faith formation webinar Wednesday, 4 o'clock. You can register again for that online. Again, thanks to DS's Blake and Deborah for leading us today. We look forward to seeing all of you again next week. God bless during this time of shelter in place, and we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.